Greetings for everyone. It's very nice to be here, and thank you to Bob particularly for inviting me here. I'm Kojonen from the University of Helsinki, Finland, and I'm here as a theologian and a philosopher of religion also. Just trying to relate this very interesting, intriguing theology and science conversation to the conversation that's being had in the analytic philosophy of religion concerning the laws of nature and miracles. So, if we look at the discussion of a couple hundred years, there's been a very general presupposition, or sort of the received view, that somehow classical science and miracles are in contradiction. Now, this is particularly clear if we look at the mechanistic worldview that soon followed in the heels of the scientific revolution. Now, it was thought that classical physics in particular led to a view of the world where everything happens through sort of lockstep processes, very predictably, very easily scientifically studyably. And events occurred in a sort of deterministic chain, just like the gears of a watch. That's the idea of a mechanical worldview. And the idea was that if God were to intervene somehow, it would be as akin to just putting his finger inside the gears, somehow just messing up the whole system, and there's no room for that. But it wasn't just the view of some philosophers and scientists, but it's also become the view of many theologians. And for example, Rudolf Bultmann famously argued that it's impossible to use an electric light and wireless and to avail ourselves of modern medical and surgical discoveries and at the same time to believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. And as Bob Ulanovich just mentioned in his own lecture, a more recent example is the esteemed theologian Philip Hefner, who stated that when asked if he believes in miracles, stated that it appears that the laws of physics just don't leave enough wiggle room for God to act in this way in the world. Well, in my own survey and analysis of the literature, I've seen two different broad ways of answering this kind of deterministic view. And the first way to answer it is, of course, based on the new scientific discoveries that have been made since the classical science of the Enlightenment age and the scientific revolution on which the deterministic worldview was based. We can say that, well, since we have things like the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics and so on, and we can construct a model of the world in which determinism doesn't seem as credible anymore. But there's also another way to argue for the compatibility of divine action, miracles, and the natural sciences. And this is based on philosophical and theological arguments rather than new scientific discoveries. And certainly, even during the scientific revolution, everyone didn't suddenly reject belief in miracles and divine action in the world. Actually, if we look at scientists, particularly in the Anglo-American world, in England, we see that a lot of the people who defended the reality of miracles were actually scientists. And it was a philosopher, David Hume, whose critique was highly influential, together with the critique of French Enlightenment philosophers and scientists in dislodging belief in miracles. So it could be very well, of course, that the philosophers were right in their interpretation of classical science, but it could also be that they were actually wrong, and they went far beyond the evidence that was available. So, and this is the sort of arguments that have been focused on in the analytic theology and analytic philosophy discussion. And that's my point sort of in this paper is to try to build bridges between these two approaches. And I'm saying that there's a consilience between the arguments and they all point in the same direction. It appears that actually science and belief in divine action, even in miracles, seems to be, it seems like there's some possibility to combine them. So just in this paper, I won't really have time to go into all of the details very much, but I'm just going to introduce a few arguments from philosophy and from theology. Now, of course, the figures who I'm looking at are varied and many, but A few of the figures, particularly, are William Alston and Alvin Plantinga, particularly in his book Where the Conflict Really Lies, is really popularized the argument from a philosophical point of view. And although there are some weaknesses to it, I think nevertheless the basic point is very interesting. Now he begins by questioning the basis of jumping from classical physics to miracles. And he argues that classical science by itself isn't enough to make these sort of conclusions. It's not part of Newtonian mechanics or classical science generally to declare that the material universe is a closed system. Science in classically, as it was done, dealt with very small experiments usually and modeling big systems of course also, but science was never able to, even in the classical era of course, to predict all the varied events that happen in the world because the world was just too complex. But it could also be that they shouldn't have assumed in that time that it was just a matter of time before science was able to explain everything. It could also be that they should have realized the limited nature of the experiments. Just a very simple example to illustrate this. Let's say I throw a stone up in the air. Now let's try to predict scientifically what will happen to the stone. We have the laws of gravity, of course, and we can predict that the stone will fall down and hit the ground. But what if I grab the stone, or someone else grabs the stone? Have we then violated the laws of physics? Because it didn't fall to the ground. Our predictions were broken. Well, Plantinga would say, and I would say, that of course we haven't violated the laws of physics. We just violated the scientific prediction. We just didn't take into account all of the forces that act in nature. Now, the laws of nature haven't been violated. So clearly the violation of the laws and the violation of predictions are two different things. And many similar examples like this can be given where the predictions of idealized scientific models are falsified, and this can lead us to the conclusion that we need to expand our worldview to take other factors into account. So what Alston and Plantinga are arguing that all scientific laws necessarily include qualifications, which are called ceteris paribus conditions. They only apply if all things are equal to the model. But if we introduce some factor that isn't taken into account in the model, then the predictions no longer fail. And we don't need to talk about the violation of the laws, which I'd say. Alston says it like this. The laws we have reason to accept lay down sufficient conditions only within a closed system, meaning a system closed to influences other than those specified in the law. None of our laws take account of all possible influences, so even if a formulation took account of all influences with which we are acquainted, we can never be assured that no hitherto unknown influences are lurking on the horizon. So there's no scientific result really that could say that tomorrow we won't find some new evidence that requires us to posit new kinds of scientific laws. And mere science also can't say that the power of God couldn't be such an influence that isn't taken into account. So as Plantinga says the point like this, that the laws of nature only describe how things go when the universe is causally closed, meaning subject to no outside causal influence. So they don't even try to tell us how things always go. They just tell us how things go when we know the factors. And if God is acting in the system, then we don't know the factors, and science can't really justifiably say that miracles can't occur. Okay, so the basic conclusion is just that even if we had classical physics, we should be merely classical physics, we should be humble and recognize the limits imposed by the way in which we formulate these laws, the ceteris paribus conditions, the complexity of nature in relation to the ideal models. And any further metaphysical conclusions require further philosophical arguments. Okay, now there's a lot of interesting further points that could be made here, particularly, for example, I used the example of human freedom when about throwing the stone. The science can't seem to predict human action there. So it seems like if theology is the only place where this kind of scientific predictability breaks down, then it seems like special pleading. It seems like well, if science explains everything else, then why should we think that there's some unknown force like God acting in the world? But if we also admit that at least human action also can't be yet described in that way, then this should leave classical physicists some grounds for humility. Okay, on to a few theological questions. While Alston and Plantinga make this sort of scientific philosophy of science-based arguments, there's also been some theological arguments for the possibility of miracles. It's been argued, for example, by Thomist philosopher theologian Ignacio de Silva that, well, if we look at classical theology, like Thomas Aquinas' view, the possibility of miracles doesn't actually depend on what the laws of nature are like, but on what God is like. For example, even in medieval times, it wasn't thought that natural objects themselves have some kind of ability to perform miracles, like that a body would just have the ability to heal instantaneously or something. It was always thought to be beyond the capacity of natural objects. One example that I've read refers to God's ability, for example, to arrange these kinds of blocks of wood into a ship spontaneously. It wasn't thought that the blocks of wood had some kind of physical propensity towards doing such a thing, rather that God was able to, because of his omnipotence and because of his metaphysical relation to the world, to create such events. So some thinkers in the modern discussion have taken this quite far and have stated that, well, we actually don't need to find any grounds of openness from physics, and it's a sort of mistaken understanding of the nature of the concept of miracle and divine action. Say that we need to find grounds from physics to say that nature is open, because the grounds are elsewhere in God's nature and in the metaphysical level rather than on the level of physics. I think you can make a valid argument like this, but I would also again go for consilience of theology, physics and philosophy. If we can find an argument from physics to supplement this theological argument, then our case will be much stronger. As a final point, I would like to point out one place where I think the theology and science community, and particularly Bob Russell, comes close sometimes to this kind of philosophical arguments, and this in the area of eschatology. As we know, Russell takes very seriously the challenge of scientific eschatology to Christian eschatology. If we look at the standard Big Bang model, it predicts that the universe will eventually eternally be in a frozen or heated state, and nothing will happen. And this is a big challenge to the Christian eschatology, which states that sometimes the universe will end and there will be the universe will be changed. There is a contradiction between the prediction of science and Christian belief, just as in the case of miracles, there is a contradiction between a prediction of science. So Russell's solution here is to question the philosophical assumptions of this prediction. The prediction of eschatology of science that the universe is freezing is based on the assumption that we know all the factors that will affect the future of the universe, and they are only scientific factors. So, but if we give up this philosophical assumption and take into account the nature of God and the metaphysical relation of God to the universe as its creator, we can recognize that God has the ability to make even large-scale changes in the cosmos which are not predicted by science. So in this way, I think Russell also realizes in his work that things like Nioda are not the only way, and he says it explicitly that the openness we see in physics is not the only way God acts in the world, but there are also places like the resurrection and the eschatology where we must assume sort of very much higher level activity of God, which is not totally beyond what can be predicted by physics. And here there's a big convergence, I think, of these two different fields of analytic theology and theology of science, because both realized the importance of philosophical and theological arguments. Well, thank you. Any questions? Yes, please.
Well, you've dealt with semi-classical physics. Have you ever looked into
Well, my understanding, of course, your question is related to eschatology here.
Well, I'm just commenting what the quantum physicists understand to be the case, which is that the laws of physics, we know them, will not continue indefinitely. At some point, they have to change because the quantum vacuum is metastable.
Well, I think that all this kind of stuff based on the new scientific discoveries is very important and interesting. And I've just focused here in my paper on the basic question, well, what if we didn't have all these wonderful new scientific discoveries? Would we then have to be adherents of this kind of mechanical scientific worldview and continue to disbelieve in miracles? And was this really a justified conclusion that we could have drawn from classical physics, or is it more like this sort of secular meta-narrative that's accepted also for emotional and social reasons, not just because it's the most rational necessarily? Yes, Jerry.
Especially miracles, we want to look back to Scripture, but also claims of occurrences of miracles today. I was wondering if you looked into investigations of claims of occurrence in terms of how many have actually been, like in the Catholic Committee that investigates. If you've looked into what's the frequency of occurrence of claims of miracles today.
Well, I am just in the process of reading Craig Keener's 2-volume investigation of current miracle claims. It's quite interesting that they are very common even in the modern era. One of Hume's arguments against the possibility of miracles was that, well, if we don't, the credibility of miracles was that if we don't observe any miracle claims today, then of course no miracle claims could be credible even in historical times. I think Keener shows pretty convincingly that there's quite a broad variety of miracle claims. But I personally haven't done any in-depth investigation of such claims. But I think there are a lot more substantial miracle claims today than many people think. Any further questions?
Saying what